Unit 6, Spiritual Renewal. 2A, Listening 1, The Religious Tradition of Fasting. Page 125.
But while there are differences in approach and style, those who fast are most often hoping to increase spirituality and come closer to the divine. Dr. Diana Eck, professor of comparative religion at Harvard Divinity School, says fasting accomplishes this in part by breaking an attachment to material things.
Page 126. Listening for main ideas.
Fasting is an ancient tradition. The three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all trace it back to the prophets of the Old Testament. For example, many believe the Prophet Muhammad's first fast was probably Yom Kippur. Many Eastern religions trace their roots of fasting to ancient yogic and ascetic traditions. But while there are differences in approach and style, those who fast are most often hoping to increase spirituality and come closer to the divine. Dr. Diana Eck, professor of comparative religion at Harvard Divinity School, says fasting accomplishes this in part by breaking an attachment to material things.
And of course, the most repetitive attachment to earthly things is that we enact every day by our desire for food. So there is a way in which breaking that, even in a symbolic way, speaks against the consumption, the materialism that is so pervasive in our world.
Professor Barbara Patterson of Emory University is an Episcopal priest. She says fasting is similar to the discipline displayed by an athlete in a gym, although in the case of fasting, it's a spiritual gym.
There's a celebration itself in establishing a discipline for oneself and actually working, making decisions, forming the will, if you would say, intention, to be able to move through a time where there's a certain amount of stress that's not undoing, but that gives you a sense of your capacities. It's very much a way of sharpening the heart's capacities.
The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, fast the first Sunday of every month. They skip 2 meals and take the money they would have spent on those meals and give it to the poor. Mormon Bart Marcois says fasting helps to foster humility and gratitude, allowing him to put aside his human competitiveness. In Islam, during the holy month of Ramadan, Muslims fast from sunrise to sunset, refraining from food, water, smoking, and sex. Dr. Akbar Ahmed, a professor of Islamic studies at American University, says in this time of rapid change and fear, fasting is vital to spiritual well-being.
Because if you do not withdraw during the day, then the replenishment of the soul is not being affected. And when that does not happen, then over time, the individual begins to become exhausted, spiritually exhausted.
Dr. Ahmed says the rhythm of life has become so hectic, so fast-moving, that finding time to pull back from our daily lives, even temporarily, has become more difficult than ever. But he says that only means the need for it has never been greater, and that the ancient tradition of fasting is still necessary, even in the 21st century. Duncan Moon, NPR News, Washington.
Page 126. Listening for details. Listen again to Listening for Main Ideas. Page 127. Reacting to the listening. Exercise 1. Excerpt 1.
Dr. Diana Eck, professor of comparative religion at Harvard Divinity School, says fasting accomplishes this in part by breaking an attachment to material things.
And of course, the most repetitive attachment to earthly things is that we enact every day by our desire for food. So there is a way in which breaking that, even in a symbolic way, speaks against the consumption, the materialism that is so pervasive in our world.
Excerpt 2.
Professor Barbara Patterson of Emory University is an Episcopal priest. She says fasting is similar to the discipline displayed by an athlete in a gym, although in the case of fasting, It's a spiritual gym.
There's a celebration itself in establishing a discipline for oneself and actually working, making decisions, forming the will. It's very much a way of sharpening the heart's capacities.
Excerpt 3.
Dr. Akbar Ahmed says in this time of rapid change and fear, fasting is vital to spiritual well-being.
Because if you do not withdraw during the day, then the replenishment of the soul is not being affected. And when that does not happen, then over time, the individual begins to become exhausted, spiritually exhausted.
2b. Listening to. Describing monastic life. Page 128.
Was this sort of an intellectual fact-finding journey, or was this a spiritual quest for you?
It was a number of things. It was certainly a project that I took on as a journalist, as a writer. It was also a spiritual journey for me because it allowed me to continue my journey in the monastic traditions and what I might find there and how that might apply to my life and what I could communicate about what I had witnessed in these various communities.
I want to draw you out on the subject of the work of the monastery.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you briefly talk about the work of that monastery, which is, in a sense, the easiest to illustrate?
Sure. Although Wat Tam Krabak is part of this forest monastic tradition, it was different in the sense that they were working on issues that were outside of the monastery. They had taken on efforts of working with AIDS patients and also providing assistance with Hmong villagers who were refugees out of Laos, who had began gathering in that area where the monastery was located. So actually, a great deal of their time was spent in this work, the AIDS work, and also the work with the refugees, which created a little different situation in terms of their daily schedule, in terms of how rigorous their chanting schedule was, in terms of the solitude of the community, because there were a lot of people coming in, children as well as adults, as well as Westerners, coming in to view this program for the AIDS patients, also for drug addicts. They also worked in that area. So there was a lot of movement in and out of the community, which made it a different situation than what I experienced in other forest monasteries.
What were you ever? I'm going to use a term that not totally flattering, but this notion of the monastic day tripper, the visitor. Were you? I know that sometimes you were sort of greeted with a bit of suspicion. Isn't that fair to say?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I talk in the book about a term that I learned on Mount Athos, the two-legged wolf, the idea of an individual being on pilgrimage, but really more interested in the uniqueness of what this community is and sort of the temporary visitor. And there were certainly times when there was suspicion about my time in those communities.
The two-legged wolf obviously refers to sort of tourists who are kind of visiting the beaches in Thailand and the monks at Mount Athos, kind of joyriders. But what specific impact have the two-legged wolves had, say, on Mount Athos? Well,
on Mount Athos, for example, at one time there was maybe a 7 or 10 day period that men could make a pilgrimage on the peninsula. Because of the numbers of men that are wanting to be on Mount Athos, they've reduced that period of time to 4 days. Actually, 4 days was 5 or 6 years ago, so they may have reduced it even further than that. But it creates a demand on the land, and it also creates a time demand on the part of the communities.
You also visited another monastery that's well known, and from your description, too well known to our listeners. That's the Monasterio de Santo Domingo in Spain, which has gained international notoriety. And tell us why, please, and what impact that's had.
Well, as you may remember, there was a very popular album of Gregorian chant called the Chant Album that was produced back in the early 90s. And that was a recording made by the monks, Benedictine monks at El Monasterio de Santo Domingo, which is in Sillos, Spain. Although they had been making recordings for the last 20 years, this particular recording happened to catch on internationally. So that's actually one of their cottage industries there at the monastery. This is one of the ways that they're able to survive, by making their recordings.
But what impact? I mean, celebrity and going platinum isn't like the greatest thing that's ever happened to them, is it?
No, I mean it's one of many ways that they do make a living, and they see it as an extension of their work, of their spirituality, of their hospitality, really, of sharing their music with the world.
Did you ever get a sense of, I mean, there must be some sort of excess revenues there. What does that particular monastery do with the royalties from the CD?
All I know is that the money goes back into their work, the community work.
4A. Pronunciation. Page 133.
Divine, divinity, grateful, gratitude, heal, health.
Page 133. Exercise 1. 1.
Divine, divinity, right, ritual, decide, decision, right, written.
2.
Grateful, gratitude, explain, explanatory, Spain, Spanish, nation, national.
3.
Compete, competitiveness, keep, kept, steal, stealth, please, pleasure.
4C. Style. Page 139. Exercise 1.
Give me an idea, William, of as a guest, and your experiences were various enough that there's not going to be one schedule that applied to every monastery, but more or less, how would the day start? When would it start? How would it unfold for you when you are in retreat?
Well, I'll pull an example from Thailand, where I spent time in a forest monastery in the northeast part of the country near the Laotian border. It's an old tradition, the forest monastic tradition in Thailand. We would wake up at 3:30 in the morning. We would gather as community to chant for approximately an hour and a half to 2 hours. We would chant, we would also sit meditation, we would also walk meditation. From there, each individual would return to their living space and focus on their meditation. They would then come back together again. In this tradition, the monks would go out and collect food in the morning. They would go out in the community. So that was an important daily ritual, to collect food for their one meal of the day. They would go out, collect the food in the various villages that surrounded the community, come back, deliver the food. The food would then be served to the community. Then there would be a separation of the members of the community to again return to their meditation. A little later, there would be a work period late in the morning and a work period in the afternoon. The community would come back together again for at least 2 more chanting sessions before the evening chant. But usually the evening chant would end about 8:30 or 9, and then the individuals were permitted to study, return to their living quarters to meditate. It was independent time.
Unit 7. Workplace Privacy. 2A. Listening 1. Interview on Workplace Surveillance. Page 150.
And the practice is on the rise. According to the ACLU Workplace Rights Project, the number of employees being monitored has doubled in the last 5 years. What's driving this increase? Partly it's competition. If everyone else in an industry is keeping tabs on their workers, there's pressure to join in. But to a large extent, companies have stepped up monitoring simply because it could be done, cheaply and efficiently.
Page 150. Listening for Main Ideas. Part 1.
Many employees can assume that they're being watched while they work during the day. The majority of U.S. companies keep watch on their workers with video cameras, tape recorders, computer surveillance. Most employers insist that these are legitimate and even necessary business practices, but as NPR's Lane Corey reports, many attorneys are arguing that employees do not give up their privacy rights when they show up for work.
If you send personal email on your office computer, there's a good chance the boss is keeping an eye on you. In a new survey of more than 900 major U.S. companies, nearly 2/3 of them acknowledged using a range of surveillance methods to monitor their employees. Eric Greenberg directed the survey for the American Management Association.
Employees should know that any employee at any time may be under watch, and that any employee's communications, be they on the phone or via the internet, may be subject to review.
Greenberg issues that warning, but some employers do not. In what he calls the most worrisome finding of the survey, up to 1/4 of the companies that monitor their workforce do it secretly, and the practice is on the rise. According to the ACLU Workplace Rights Project, the number of employees being monitored has doubled in the last 5 years. What's driving this increase? Partly it's competition. If everyone else in an industry is keeping tabs on their workers, there's pressure to join in. But to a large extent, companies have stepped up monitoring simply because it could be done, cheaply and efficiently. Yet Greenberg says even as surveillance becomes more widespread, there's nothing sinister about the practice itself.
When you read data like this, there's a certain tendency to do a Big Brother metaphor. Big Brother is watching and whatever. But really, I think that's a cheap shot. What we're talking about, for the most part, are very legitimate forms of performance monitoring.
Greenberg says employers have a right to know how equipment they provide is being used on the job, if rules are being obeyed, if employees are getting the job done. That helps explain why banks routinely tape customer service calls and why the U.S. Postal Service is testing a satellite system to track how long it takes to get the mail delivered.
Part 2.
But Larry Finneran with the National Association of Manufacturers says companies are using technology to accomplish other important goals. Video cameras were recently installed in his building to deter theft, and the association keeps a log of all phone calls so employees can pay the company for their personal calls. According to Finneran, monitoring can be used for the worker's own protection.
Employee is sending pornography from the employer's computer. Obviously, the employer would be expected to go through there. If somebody complains about sexual harassment, that somebody sending out racial slurs over the email, the employer has a right to take action.
In fact, the Chevron Corporation was sued by female employees who said they were sexually harassed through company email. That's all well and good, says Rebecca Lockett, the legal director of the ACLU's Workplace Rights Project. She concedes there are legitimate uses of monitoring programs. But too often, says Lockett, surveillance practices demean workers for no good reason.
You certainly do not need to monitor keystrokes. When you give someone 50 reports to key into a computer and you see that they have only completed 20 by day's end, you don't need to count keystrokes. They only finished 2/5.
Lockett argues that employees should not have to leave their human dignity at the workplace door, and she says they're entitled to a few safeguards in this area. First, the ACLU says employees should always be informed when they're monitored, and second,
there should be no monitoring whatsoever in purely private areas.
Part 3.
Yet so far there is only one state, Connecticut, that forbids surveillance in areas such as locker rooms or the employee lounge. In other states, employers do secretly videotape private places if they suspect theft or criminal activities such as drug dealing. There's only one federal statute, the 1986 Electronic Communications Privacy Act, that safeguards employee privacy. But according to Larry Finneran with the National Association of Manufacturers, the scope of the act is limited to eavesdropping on private telephone calls.
There are specific rules about employer listening for content of personal phone calls. An employer can limit duration of personal phone calls. An employer can say no personal phone calls. But under the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, an employer cannot listen for content, and that they are already protected to that degree.
Employee rights attorney Penny Nathan Kahn is involved in a case over this very issue. She says as companies continue to expand employee monitoring, workers are turning to the courts to protect their rights.
And unless there is a substantial interest to be served by the employer, I don't think the juries are going to look at the willy-nilly surveillance and monitoring very sympathetically.
There may even be good business reasons for companies to think twice about increased surveillance. Studies link electronic monitoring to higher levels of worker stress, which can lead to lower productivity. I'm Elaine Corey reporting.
Page 151. Listening for details. Listen again to Listening for Main Ideas. Page 152. Reacting to the listening. Exercise 1. Excerpt 1.
Employees should know that any employee at any time may be under watch, and that any employee's communications, be they on the phone or via the internet, may be subject to review.
Excerpt 2.
When you read data like this, there's a certain tendency to do a Big Brother metaphor. Big Brother is watching and whatever. But really, I think that's a cheap shot. What we're talking about, for the most part, are very legitimate forms of performance monitoring.
Excerpt 3.
You certainly do not need to monitor keystrokes. When you give someone 50 reports to key into a computer and you see that they have only completed 20 by day's end, you don't need to count keystrokes. They only finished 2/5.
Excerpt 4.
There should be no monitoring whatsoever in purely private areas.
2B. Listening to. Managers and employees speak out. Page 154.
Speaker 1.
I own a small data processing company in which I employ about 8 to 10 workers. The point I want to make has to do with trust. Listen, I know it's possible to force people to be 100% efficient, but when you do that, you lose morale, confidence, trust. I let my employees use our equipment, computers, make personal phone calls, whatever. They are more than welcome to decide what is right and wrong. You can't run a company by just issuing orders to robots and watching them like Big Brother. You have to trust people, respect them, and give them a little freedom. Also, as far as phone calls and all that go, I want my people to call home and check on their children and know their children are okay, because then they can refocus on the job and their work is better. As a result, I have dedicated employees who are willing to go that extra mile, to show up at work smiling. I get more satisfaction and rewards by trusting my employees than by suspecting them of doing something wrong.
Speaker 2.
I'm an attorney in a large law firm in Seattle. In my firm, there's a capability, sure, of monitoring my performance. I input a lot of my work into computer systems with limited security. And you know what? I'm not bothered in the least. The real question is, if we're not doing anything wrong, what do we have to worry about? I think employers have the right to keep an eye on what goes on in their businesses, just like homeowners have the right to use video and audio surveillance to protect their own homes. I mean, you would have to agree that when you're in the office, you're not conducting your private life. You're conducting business. In some cases, such as lounge areas at work, there's a fine line, but mostly, I believe it's okay for, an employer to actually listen and watch while you're working. They're just safeguarding their businesses.
Speaker 3. I'm a chemist in a large pharmaceutical company. I would like to say specifically that private communication that doesn't relate to my job shouldn't be an open book just because it happens to occur between 9 and 5. I've got a right to talk privately even on the job. It's impossible to totally separate my job from my home. Let me just pose a question here. Isn't it a fact that we all take work home every once in a while? And every once in a while, you've got to have a communication at work, on the phone, on your computer, or your email that isn't work-related. If I were making 47 long-distance calls to Honolulu for no real reason, sure, my boss would want to know why I'm running up all these long-distance phone bills. Maybe something sinister is going on, but a handful of local phone calls that everybody has to make once in a while, I don't get why any employer would or should object to that. I don't see why an employer has any legitimate reason to bug my phone to find out who I just called. It's an invasion of my privacy, and it's just not fair. Speaker 4.
I run a video production company and employ about 50 professionals. The point I want to make is this. Even though I trust my employees, the company is still mine. Stuff on their desk, their work product, and other things, while it may be inappropriate for me to look at it or even remove it, the fact of the matter is, it's not private stuff. I have a right to know the materials in the workplace. If it's a work product, I may need access to it. And one more thing I want to say. I could also go into their computers after they leave and read all sorts of business-related documents. It's my right.
4A. Pronunciation. Page 159. Exercise 1.
Companies record service calls. They keep records of personal phone calls made by employees. The object of installing the surveillance equipment was to create a top-notch security system. I don't understand why any employee would or should object to that.
Page 159. Exercise 2. 1.
The ACLU director was shocked by the increase in monitoring and was afraid that willy-nilly surveillance would continue to increase.
2.
We decided to conduct a comprehensive survey to measure employee conduct.
3.
The object of my presentation is simply to object to the use of secret surveillance.
4.
The boss suspects that she is the only suspect in the case involving the stolen computer files.
5.
She got a special permit that would permit her to see confidential employee information.
6.
We all had to keep a special record in order to record all personal phone calls.
7.
Why do you always insult me with all those insults? Just tell me how to fix the mistakes.
8.
We're pleased with your progress in the job so far, but you'll have to progress even further before getting promoted.
9.
As hard as I tried to settle the conflict with my boss, our opinions continued to conflict over certain key issues.
10.
The company projects big profits from these projects.
4D. Speaking topic. Page 166.
Governor, I appreciate your taking the time to meet with me.
My pleasure.
The employee monitoring law has received a great deal of media attention recently. However, many Illinois citizens are still very confused. What exactly does the new law allow?
This law permits employers to listen in on their workers' phone conversations. The law permits any listening that serves educational, training, or research purposes. It allows for both computer and phone monitoring.
How did this law come about?
Well, it was originally conceived by the telemarketing industry. This industry, which uses the telephone to sell its products and services, needed a way to monitor its employees' sales performance. The retail industry is also a big proponent of the law. Recently, I spoke with the president of the Illinois Retail Merchants Association. He told me the law is helping to make sure that Mrs. Smith gets the red dress in size 6 rather than size 16, which may have been entered into the computer by mistake.
So, in other words, the law is meant to monitor the quality of customer service calls.
Yes, for courtesy, efficiency, overall service.
Well, then, why all the opposition? I hear that many groups, from unions to the ACLU, are clearly furious about this law.
Yes, I know. Our office has been flooded with calls and letters. The problem is, the law does not specify whether or not employers must tell employees each time they are being monitored or just issue a one-time blanket warning. Also, only one person must agree to the monitoring. But the law does not state who must agree, the employee or the supervisor. The scope of the law is so broad that some people find it frightening.
Yes, it sounds like there are many unanswered questions. I appreciate your speaking with me, Governor. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Unit 8. Warriors Without Weapons. 2A. Listening 1. Warriors Without Weapons. Page 173.
This is Fresh Air. I'm Terry Gross. Journalist Michael Ignatieff spent a year traveling to the sites of volatile regional wars. He wanted to learn how war is changing and what that means for the safety of relief workers. In a recent New Yorker article called Unarmed Warriors, he wrote about the International Committee of the Red Cross, the new risks its unarmed members face in war zones, and the new controversies surrounding the group's position of neutrality. I asked him why he wanted to write about the Red Cross.
Page 174. Listening for Main Ideas. Part 1.
This is Fresh Air. I'm Terry Gross. Journalist Michael Ignatieff spent a year traveling to the sites of volatile regional wars. He wanted to learn how war is changing and what that means for the safety of relief workers. In a recent New Yorker article called Unarmed Warriors, he wrote about the International Committee of the Red Cross, the new risks its unarmed members face in war zones, and the new controversies surrounding the group's position of neutrality. I asked him why he wanted to write about the Red Cross.
As a group, I was very drawn to them because I thought they could take me into the whole world of what involves people in that kind of humanitarian relief work. From being interested in the Red Cross, I then became interested in the laws of war and came to see that the laws of war are a very different moral tradition than, say, the human rights tradition. And I began to see that there are two traditions at work out there in the humanitarian movement. One of them is, international human rights, which most Americans can identify with. And then there's this very different tradition called the laws of war tradition, which is basically trying to make sure that if people are going to fight, conduct the fighting according to certain rules. And that's what the Red Cross is trying to do.
Part 2.
Well, the International Committee of the Red Cross is trying to disseminate information about the Geneva Conventions, about the international laws of war. What are they trying to do? How are they trying to educate people who are fighting about these codes?
Well, I think, first of all, we need to back up a little and just understand what the codes are. There are these things called the Geneva Conventions, which were ratified by hundreds of countries in the basic document dates to 1864 and then it's revised in 1949. There are a bunch of rules that are quite simple. They simply say don't fire on ambulances, don't shoot on non-combatants, don't torture prisoners, allow prisoners to communicate with their families, allow the Red Cross to visit you if you're a prisoner of war, spare civilians. I mean, they're very house and garden common rules, and in lots of combat situations, they function more or less adequately. The Gulf War, for example, when the 100,000 Iraqi prisoners were taken, the United States subscribed to the Geneva Conventions, released them according to those conventions. So it's a system that, it's easy to laugh at. People say, you can't wage a war that's civilized. Well, in fact, the Geneva Conventions have done a lot to civilize certain aspects of war, and so they have a lot of legitimacy. I think something very interesting is going on there, an attempt to say the standards of decency that ought to prevail in the world are not white Western European values. They're human universals, and if you look deeply enough into your own traditions of warrior culture, you will find them. And that's what the Red Cross is trying to do. They're just beginning that work, but they're putting out comic books that tell the story. They're running radio soap operas to tell the story. They're not just sitting there reading out the Geneva Conventions. They're trying to translate them into new languages. And it's one of the most interesting bits of work that's going on.
Part 3.
Yes, and I think what I'm trying to get at here is that it's a sort of counterintuitive thought. One of the oldest moral traditions that all human societies have is the warrior tradition, the tradition of warrior's honor. The idea that a warrior has a very dangerous and therefore sacred responsibility. That is, his job is to protect the community and to engage in the infliction of death. Because that's a very dangerous and very serious task, men have to be trained for it. And they're trained not to simply unleash their aggression, but to control it and to discipline it and use it for the benefit of the community. And those traditions then mean that there's certain people you can kill and there's certain people it's wrong to kill. There's certain ways of waging war that are honorable and certain ways of waging war that are dishonorable. Most modern military forces attempt in some way or the other to subscribe to those very ancient codes. And I think we forget, partly because war has become so awful and so horrible and so devastating, we've come to equate war with pure barbarism and pure savagery. It seems to us to be a zone where morality cannot prevail at all. And so it's a rather counterintuitive thought that, in fact, the warrior's honor is one of the oldest moral traditions in the world. And the Red Cross is trying, in a way, to simply institutionalize that culture, remind people that in their own cultures they can find elements of a warrior's honor which should restrain their people.
Page 175. Listening for details. Listen again to Listening for Main Ideas. Page 176. Reacting to the listening. Exercise 1. Excerpt 1.
And I began to see that there are two traditions at work out there in the humanitarian movement. One of them is, international human rights, which most Americans can identify with.
Excerpt 2.
I think something very interesting is going on there.